It's the Valley of Ürgüp, a valley of tortured rock formations which was lost to history for 400 years. And when the French traveller and explorer Luca rediscovered it in the 18th century, the court of Louis XV refused to believe that a landscape of such fantastic shapes could exist, that there were cones and pyramids and towers in this desert 100 miles from Lake Tuz, the Great Salt Lake. There are miles and miles of these cones in this valley, and they're not the work of some monster ants or the frantic carvings of an ancient race trying to placate their gods. They're the whittlings of nature, of violent earthquake. A volcano spewed up this plateau and this valley, gave it its fairy tale castles, its cathedral spires, and its soft volcanic stone. But the people of the valley will tell you another story. They say that thousands of years ago, a great warrior stole the Sultan's daughter, and the valley was full of his enemies hotly in pursuit. So the warrior came up here and prayed for a miracle to happen to halt this army. And his God obliged. He turned the army into stone, where they stand to this day, a ghostly host with rakish hats and plumed helmets. But they're more than just odd shapes crowding a lunar landscape, these cones which seem to march across a Disneyland desert. People actually lived in them, hollowed out doors, windows, rooms, homes inside these soft volcanic rocks. They even built dovecotes for their pigeons, pigeons which would provide them with meat in wintertime and droppings to manure their meager crops in the spring. And they built more than houses, these troglodytes who chose to live in this terrible place. They built villages right along their valley, burrowing like moles into the cliffs and cones, torn into weird shapes by years of wind and water. They built whole stories high, the skyscrapers of their day. And they built themselves little churches. For the people who came to live in this sun-baked desert were early Christians, converts of St. Paul. They scratched themselves lonely cells out here in the wilderness so that they could contemplate their new God in isolation. And it was here that these men were first called Christians. That was in the first 100 years after Christ's death. But it didn't take long for others to hear of Ürgüp. The persecutions of the emperors Diocletian and Julian helped to almost urbanize the valley. It became the place to live if you were a Christian on the run. And there was never any housing problem for these refugees. All they needed was a flint chisel, and they could build themselves a 2 up and 2 down inside a matter of weeks. There was no jerry building here. These sanctuaries were built to last. But it can't have been much of a life for them. Water is scarce here, even today. But for centuries, they do seem to have lived in peace, even if the living was rough. Later, more ambitious Christians followed. And it was the Byzantines who built these bigger churches from the 9th to the 12th centuries. Some pillars of rock have not just 1, but 2 churches built into them. They decorated them with the pop art of their day, these monks whose communities outlived the first Muslim invasions. Some painted their frescoes of the saints and the Ascension crudely on the bare walls, others with more sophistication on plaster. And underneath one painting, 2 footmarks, the footprints of the sandals of Christ, the Byzantines called them. But after these religious communities, and at one time there were 30,000 people living in the valley, after these religious communities had gone, generations of Turks despoiled their images, broke the Christian faces with the Muslim spears. No one can say when this great Christian settlement died. No one knows why they left their desert hideout or where they went. The conquering Seljuk and Ottoman Muslims were tolerant lords of this part of Turkey, and there's no record of any persecution from them. But leave they did, and suddenly. Perhaps it was because the desert winds were wearing their homes away, because these rocks of pumice stone and volcanic tuff are slowly crumbling to dust, which is fair enough when you consider that some of them have lasted for the best part of 1,000 years. But the land of pillars is far from deserted, even in 1965. People still live in the cliffs and the cones and the pillars. In fact, it's hard to tell where the modern houses begin and where the cliffs end. Only 2 years ago, these modern troglodytes had to be evicted from their homes. They're still burrowing away into what the Turkish tourist office cares to call the fairy chimneys. Nowadays, of course, they do have a few mod cons and the usual outhouses. Price, well, all you really need is a chisel and a lot of energy. Do-it-yourself bungalow or do-it-yourself flat, it's entirely up to you. And if you can do without running water, hot or cold, then this could be the place to make your holiday home in Turkey.